Hi there, my name is Dion Neame. Thank you very much for having me today. I am Sanofi's North American Senior Medical Expert, 3 to 4 days a week, and the other 1 to 2 days a week, I'm a practicing physician and I've been practicing for approximately 30 years. It's my pleasure to give you a presentation on preparing for fall, winter 2022, navigating the world of vaccines against COVID-19 and influenza. All right, so let's get started then. So today we'll be talking about the similarities of COVID-19 and influenza, long-term burden of influenza, vaccine technologies, effectiveness of vaccines, and Health Canada's recommendations upon those vaccines. So COVID-19 has had a huge impact on Canadians. As of May 18th, 2022, there have been 160,000 hospitalizations, 40,000 deaths in Canada related to COVID. The impact has been especially seen in those that are 50 years of age and older, making up 76% of COVID hospitalizations and 97% of COVID deaths. But the impact of COVID on Canadians goes beyond that. We've had over 500,000 fewer surgeries being performed, lost time with our loved ones, and 1 in 4 adults being screened positive for symptoms of depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorder during the pandemic. COVID-19 and influenza share many symptoms and severe complications. When we look at COVID-19 and influenza, we can see that they both share constitutional and respiratory symptoms. So for example, the constitutional symptoms would be fever, chills, sweats, tiredness, lethargy, malaise, body aches, and the respiratory symptoms, runny nose, cough, sore throat, headache. COVID-19 has some unusual and unique symptoms such as shortness of breath, loss of taste and smell, and also has long-term complications. The long-term complications of COVID-19 we're still trying to figure out. It's termed long COVID, tends to be neuropsychiatric in nature, but we're waiting for more studies to elucidate exactly what's going on with long COVID. In regard to influenza, we understand over the last 10 years of doing studies what the long-term effects of influenza are, and I'll go into that a little bit later in the presentation. So while influenza and COVID-19 viruses impact everyone, similar populations are at high risk for both. You'll find that high risk for severe illness are older adults, people with chronic medical conditions, lung disease, heart disease, kidney disease, and diabetes. A question: I have symptoms, but it's not COVID, so I'm safe, right? Well, let's talk a little bit about influenza. The burden of seasonal influenza is very estimated, and that's because we see what we see. Influenza is a respiratory infection, so what we see is the respiratory side. And when we're taking swabs of those people with respiratory infections, we'll find that influenza comes up positive in about 2.5 million cases per year, approximately 12,000 hospitalizations, and approximately 3,500 deaths. But the thing is that we always thought that infectious diseases were sitting on an island and chronic diseases were sitting on an island, and they were fairly separated. What we're understanding now over the last 5 years or so is that they're actually, these two islands are connected. And in fact, they're connected by about a highway, and that highway is the immune system. So what ends up happening is influenza and COVID, these infectious diseases, they can precipitate chronic diseases. It's like flicking the first domino, and then you follow a cascade of diseases such as heart attacks, strokes, worsening of chronic diseases, or loss of autonomy. Potential complications of influenza tend to be divided into two different categories. There's respiratory or direct effects, and there's multi-organ systems or indirect effects. The respiratory effects tend to be exacerbation of underlying diseases such as asthma or chronic obstructive pulmonary diseases, or upper respiratory tract bacterial infections such as ear infections, otitis media, or sinus infections, sinusitis, or lower respiratory tract infections such as bronchitis or bacterial pneumonia. Indirect effects tend to be either triggering or exacerbating of chronic diseases. When we're talking about triggering of diseases, we tend to be discussing the cardiovascular system, and it's the innate immune system or the generalized immune system which seems to be the problem here. When you get an infectious disease, your innate immune system is stimulated, you're generalized, the immune system's there to fight influenza, but it's also to fight things that are apparently foreign. Now, cholesterol plaques can be considered to be foreign. So if the cytokines of the innate immune system go after the cholesterol plaques, they can actually break them and disrupt them and cause small bleeds in vessels. The problem is that then the small bleed is going to stimulate our cascading coagulation system, and we're going to develop a platelet clot. If that clot happens to clog the vessel that it's in, then you won't be able to get blood from the clot and distal to the clot. Now, if that happens to be in the heart, you can have a heart attack. If that happens to be in the brain, you can have a stroke. Exacerbation of chronic diseases can be the chronic diseases that the person might have. It could be kidney disease, it could be hypertension, it could be diabetes, it could be an oncology or a cancer. Let me give you some examples. So for example, heart disease and diabetes complicated by beyond the lungs. So you are 6 times more likely to have a heart attack within the week of influenza infection, especially for those over 65 years of age. Now, there's a colleague of mine, Jeff Kwong, who actually did the study at University of Toronto, the Center for Vaccine Preventable Diseases. And what he did was he used the Ontario Health Insurance Plan, OHIP, database, and he followed people from the incidence of having influenza and during that week, how many heart attacks there were, and compared that to the same people the year after having the influenza infection and the year before having the influenza infection. And what he found is that people that are 65 years of age and older, they had a 7.2-fold chance increase in having a heart attack during the week of influenza. And if just the general population would be 6 times as likely. When we look at diabetes, there's an increased likelihood for people living with diabetes to admitted to hospital for influenza compared to those without. Now that can be metabolic issues. We have something called diabetic ketoacidosis, which is a metabolic inaccuracy of the body in regard to glucose, sodium, salt manipulation within the body, and it can lead to death actually. And then we have the immune system of a diabetic, which really doesn't function as well as people without diabetes. And so they're much more susceptible to bacterial infections, particularly bacterial pneumonia. So Diabetes Canada and the Canadian Cardiovascular Society, they recommend yearly influenza vaccines. So hospitalization of older adults can lead to functional decline. This is something that we've seen quite a bit over the last 5 years, when understanding that influenza can give rise to exacerbation of chronic diseases or triggering of chronic diseases. What we see is people that are having a great old time, living life, they get influenza and they have a health event. That health event, let's say it's bacterial pneumonia, they can be admitted to the hospital. When they're in the hospital, they're usually having bed rest because they're getting antibiotics, whatnot. The problem is when you lay down in a bed for a long period of time, 1 week or 2 weeks, you have a lot of muscle atrophy. With the muscle atrophy, you gain weakness. And so once you're finished your treatment, you get out of bed, sometimes you actually have lost so much muscle mass that you can't actually walk. So you become disabled. Sometimes it can be so significant that you can actually go from an independent lifestyle to being dependent. So you might have to go from your own home to a senior's residence or, in worst case, a long-term care. So influenza can produce significant long-lasting functional decline in older adults. So another question, wait. There are different kinds of vaccines. Yes, there are different kinds of vaccines. It's kind of a funny thing, like the government says, hey, you should get this vaccine, but don't necessarily tell you what you're putting into your arm. So why don't I go over that a little bit? So the goal of a vaccine. Well, the goal of a vaccine is to introduce a harmless piece of the virus or the bacteria into your body. We call that an antigen. And your immune system can now learn to identify and destroy that virus or the bacteria through the understanding of that antigen and through the development of an immune system response to that antigen. So if you happen to encounter what we call the wild virus or the wild bacteria, now your immune system is prepared to protect yourself. It'll identify that virus or bacteria and it'll kill that virus or bacteria. So it can't go on to cause any disease. So what are the considerations when we are designing vaccines? Well, the first thing that's most important is the antigen. And the goal of the antigen is to teach our body how to protect against this wild virus or this wild bacteria. So what part of the virus do we use to teach the immune system? Well, we tend to use what's on the surface of, whether it be COVID, which would be the spike protein, or whether it be influenza, would be the H protein. These are the proteins that are very easily seen because they are the ones that help either the COVID-19 or the influenza virus get into our cells. So influenza and COVID-19 vaccines individually teach our immune system to recognize and to neutralize each specific virus. So vaccine technologies, different options of how to make and deliver the antigens. So I'm going to give you two examples of how scientists make and deliver antigens. Vaccines can directly deliver the antigen to the body. So if you look on the left-hand side of the slide, you're going to see inactivated vaccines at the top, and you're going to see recombinant protein vaccines at the bottom. So let's go to inactivated vaccines. So inactivated vaccines, you need to actually grow the influenza or COVID viruses in cells. And then once those viruses are grown, you actually inactivate them, you kill them, and you purify them. And you just take out those proteins I just talked about, those antigens. In this case, it's influenza, so the H protein. And it's actually the antigens you put inside the vial, which actually goes into your arm and stimulates your immune system to recognize those proteins and produce an immune system response, which will protect you in subsequent infection with the wild virus. The protein recombinant vaccine is a little bit different. You actually don't need to grow your influenza or your COVID virus. We actually place the instructions, or in this case, the messenger RNA, into a system. Now, the system in Sanofi, we call it the baculovirus expression system technology, or the BEST system. So we take that recipe, or that mRNA, we put it into the baculovirus. The baculovirus then infects this thing called a northern army ant. The northern army ant reads that recipe, reads that message, and actually produces those antigens. And those antigens, again, they go into the vaccine, the vial of the vaccine, that then goes into your arm, that your immune system sees as being foreign, and produces an antibody response to it. And that, again, protects you against the wild virus, or in this case, influenza infection subsequently. So in the next two examples, the vaccine delivers the instructions to make the antigen. So here we have technology that was developed because of the COVID-19 pandemic. So we, on the left-hand side at the top, we have viral vector vaccines, and then at the bottom left, we have mRNA vaccines. So the viral vector vaccines, again, they take the recipe, or the mRNA, and they place it into a weakened adenovirus. That adenovirus is then placed in the vial, and you get that adenovirus. And the adenovirus goes into your body, it goes into the cell. It doesn't cause much disease because it's a weakened adenovirus, but it does, our cellular machinery does read that recipe, does read the mRNA, and our immune system then senses those proteins. So the proteins are produced by our cellular machinery because of that messenger or RNA. It produces those proteins, and our immune system goes, oh, look at those proteins. And it says, okay, well, we're going to create an antibody response to it. Very similarly, the mRNA vaccine takes that recipe, but we don't put it in adenovirus. We put it in what we call a nanolipid particle. Great technology, nanolipid particle. We put the nanolipid particle, we put those into the vial. That's what's pushed into your arm. The nanolipid particle goes into a respiratory cell. It reads the message, it produces the proteins. Those proteins go out of the cell. Our immune system goes, oh, proteins, they're not, those are foreign, and produces an immune system response, which then gives us protection against a subsequent infection with, in this case, the wild COVID-19 virus. So I hope that helps. I know it's a little bit complicated, but so there's 4 different ways to make and deliver antigens to the body to develop immune system responses to protect them against subsequent infections with the wild virus, in this case, COVID-19 and influenza. So there are other considerations as well too, increasing the number of antigens. For example, influenza vaccines were initially 1 antigen. And then because of the divergence of the virus, they eventually had to put in 2. First one was an A, and it was H3N2. The second one was an A, and it was H1N1. Then, as again, the virus diverged, the influenza virus diverged, then they had to put in 2 A's and 2 B's. And now, more divergence with the influenza virus, we have 2 A's and 2 B's in each influenza virus. So you can increase the number of antigens. The other thing that you can do is you can increase the quantity of antigens. And again, I'll use influenza as an example. When 50 years ago when we started the influenza vaccine, they only had 7.5 micrograms of antigens. They then realized, oh, wait a minute, we got to increase that to 15. And now enhanced vaccines have 45 micrograms or 60 micrograms per antigen, because we see that the higher the antigen content, the higher the relative efficacy is compared to other influenza vaccines. They work better. There's also adjuvants. Adjuvants are defined as substances which enhance the body's immune response to the antigen. And they can be very helpful in certain viruses. Varicella zoster virus, zoster, shingles vaccines. So why are there so many kinds of vaccines? Well, it's because there's so many different types of diseases. For example, when we look at Sanofi, we produce 21 different vaccines to 16 different infectious agents, viruses, and bacteria. There's just so many different diseases. People are different. Some people are very young, and some people are in middle age, and some people are older. And our immune systems are very different through that course. We have weakened or inexperienced immune systems as babies, and as we get older, over 65 years of age, our immune system tends to get a little bit confused, and it weakens in its response to things. In that regard, we've seen this in influenza for 20 years. Influenza vaccines may not be these types of vaccines where one size fits all. 20 years ago, we saw that people that are 15 to 64 years of age responded much better to the influenza vaccine. Their effectiveness was in the 70% range. But people that were 65 years of age and older, their response to that standard influenza vaccine was only about 40 to 45%. So you had a gap. We had a gap in between. And so we wanted to close that gap. And that's why we had to discover and develop a vaccine that was better for people that were 65 years of age and older. And this is where the final box here, the improved protection. Different vaccines may work better. So when you're looking at, as an example, you're looking at influenza vaccines, you can see there's different types of manufacturing technology. So we have egg-based, and we have egg-based adjuvanted vaccines, we have cell culture-based vaccines, recombinant vaccines. But what I wanted to kind of get at here is that when you're talking about influenza particularly, we've seen a number of these different types of vaccines, so on the left-hand side. But what randomized control studies have shown us that if you really want to protect against influenza, the strategy that works really well is to increase the antigen content. So you'll see that in the green there on the slide, you can see that they have a high-dose vaccine, 60 micrograms per antigen. This works much better, 24.2% better in randomized control studies against the standard vaccine, which would be fine for someone who is 18 to 40 years of age. Oops, sorry about that. Also, then we have the recombinant vaccine at the very bottom. That's a quadrivalent vaccine. It's got 45 micrograms. And once again, we've seen in randomized control studies that would work 30% better than the standard dose vaccine. And so the high dose seems to work very well for influenza. Now, it's very interesting because the adjuvant, that tends to work very well for varicella zoster, or shingles vaccine. So for example, Merck had used a high-dose vaccine for shingles, and it worked about 50 to 60%, lasted about 5 years. GSK came up with an adjuvanted vaccine, and it lasted approximately 15 years, and it was 2 doses, but the adjuvant seemed to be the key. So for different infectious agents, different technologies will work better. So I'm taking precautions, and I'm fairly healthy. Would a vaccine even make a difference? Well, one of the things I can tell you is that when I finished my internal medicine and my pediatric residency, I actually completed a primary prevention of disease fellowship. And there are 4 pillars of preventing disease. Of course, there's exercise, there's nutrition, there's mental health, and there's vaccinations. But people need to address all pillars to maintain great health. So if you look at our slide up here, we have on the left-hand side, we have an Olympic senior. He's obviously exercising, going for a swim. Looks like he's made himself good nutrition, good weight, smiling away there. Mental health and mindfulness must be doing well. But if he decides that he doesn't want to vaccinate, he still is open to getting an influenza type infection or a COVID infection, which could cause this precipitate this cascading of bad health conditions, exacerbation of disease, triggering of disease, and he could end up, on the right-hand side. He could end up dependent He could be 1 to 2 to 3 weeks in the hospital. And next thing you know, he goes from an independent Olympic senior to a dependent senior, and hopefully to recover. But it's not easy to recover, from these types of things. I mean, it can take weeks, months, or never to recover. So you may actually lose your autonomy, and you may end up being in a senior's residence home, or worst case scenario, a long-term care. But hey, why listen to Dion when we've got Health Canada and its recommendations on vaccines? So Health Canada recommends influenza vaccines for all individuals 6 months of age and older. It particularly focuses on high-risk individuals who are potentially to get influenza-related complications or hospitalization. So when we talk about these groups, if you can see from the left to the right, at the top to the bottom, nursing home residents, individuals with chronic disease, older adults greater than 65 years of age. What's very interesting is the Americans would say that high-risk group is actually 50 years of age and older. If you look at children, 6 months to 59 months or 6 months to 5 years, they're at high risk. Healthcare workers and essential community workers, because they're exposed so much, and they can also give the influenza virus to other people. Pregnant women have a different immune system when they're pregnant. It's a little bit more troublesome with diseases, particularly like influenza and COVID. Close contacts to high-risk individuals, you don't want to be passing influenza on. And Indigenous people are also considered high risk. And that's because their immune system doesn't deal with respiratory infections as well as maybe as other people. So the National Advisory Committee on Immunizations is part of Health Canada, and they put out recommendations every year for influenza, and this is for the 2022-2023 season. So influenza vaccine recommendations. Now, I know this is a very busy slide, so to make it as easy as possible, what you can see on the left-hand side is actually age groups. So from 18 to 59 years of age, 60 to 64 years of age, there is recommendations that are made. There's many different influenza vaccines, and any of these available vaccines can be authorized. The reason I highlight in the green the recombinant influenza vaccine, quadrivalent, is because it's new. This is the recombinant technology I mentioned to you from Sanofi, which is using the best or the baculovirus expression system technology. That's actually new here for 2022, 2023, and that's the one that has the 45 micrograms. So it's specifically being looked at for people 50 to 64 years of age. It uses the higher dose amount. Standard dose is 15 micrograms. So, and it has been shown in randomized control studies to have 30% better effectiveness or better efficacy actually than the standard dose. Now, the thing is, the National Advisory Committee is not preferentially recommending it right now because they're waiting for a study that Sanofi is doing, which is a 3-year study through the Kaiser Permanente. It's called an integrated managed care consortium, actually, but not that really matters. But it's a 3-year study, and they're waiting for the results for that. It's just completed the study, and they're just trying to write it up and send it and get it published, most likely in the New England Journal of Medicine. When you can see the same basic slide, but from left to right, 65 years of age and older, NACI does make a preferential recommendation. It would say that you can use any of the vaccines that are listed here, but you should be using the high dose vaccine. Not surprisingly, this is the high dose platforms against influenza. So the high dose should be used over the standard dose because there's good evidence of the high dose providing better protection against the standard dose in adults that are 65 years of age and older. And you can see that I highlighted them in green. Okay. So let's just switch gears just a little bit. Health Canada also recommends COVID-19 vaccines, and they'll be offered to all individuals aged 6 months of age and older, as well as boosters in the aged over 12 years group. So when you're looking at, again, left to right, most people should be having a primary series, 1 to 2 doses, with booster doses every 6 months. So you should be, if you're just, you're a healthy person, no chronic conditions, you should have about 4 doses at this point. The immunocompromised people, that's people who take medicines that might cause immunocompromised state, or if you might have chronic diseases like cancers, oncology diseases, then you might be in that group. Primary series is actually 3 doses, and every 6 months you should have a couple of doses, or you should have a dose. So you should be about 5 doses at this particular point in time. I want to point out that there are new COVID-19 vaccines. They are what they call bivalent vaccines. They have the original COVID-19 strain, which they call the Wuhan strain, but they also have more advanced strains, either the beta strain or the Omicron strain. The beta strain is actually a Sanofi product. The Omicron strain is actually the Moderna vaccine. So there's 2 in there. It's bivalent. There's 2 in there. So that would be the new booster now, and that would be recommended. So do I really need to get a vaccine for COVID and influenza this season? Well, wow, that's the toughest question in the world. Gosh knows what's going on. I mean, it's been up and down and all over the place since we had the pandemic. And most of that has to do with the fact that we had restrictions. When you restrict people from interacting, the virus has a very, very difficult time to spread. But when you release those restrictions, then all these viruses, like particularly in April of 2022, there was all these viruses hanging around sitting on sidelines. And they all decided, well, if you're going to release the restrictions, we're all going to jump in the game. And I can tell you, working in a pediatric urgent care, in the Hamilton, Burlington, Oakville area, it's been wild. I've never seen more infectious diseases ever in my 30-year career. And so our expectations are, and these are expectations, that in the fall, yes, you will most likely need to get a COVID-19 and an influenza vaccine, because they are waxing and waning in incidence, and they seem to be both on an uptick already. So can you give both vaccines at the same time? Yeah, Health Canada says you can. That actually was a study that was done by Moderna and Sanofi. Moderna used their COVID vaccine and Sanofi used its high-dose vaccine. We gave it together. Good news story. We have 2 arms, COVID in one arm, influenza in the other arm. And it was the vaccination was safe. It was effective. It was easily given. So vaccination remains the most effective way to prevent illness, particularly when you're talking about both those respiratory infections, COVID and influenza. So we're building better vaccines to meet the needs of you good folks. You good folks may sort of have different needs, different populations, and to build a better tomorrow. It's been a pleasure speaking to you, and I have a few closing remarks. Well, thanks very much for having me, folks. I hope that through the presentation, I've conveyed the similarities and differences between COVID-19 and influenza, that persons over 50 years of age are particularly at risk for bad outcomes with COVID and influenza, and then an effective way of priming our immune system against subsequent infections with COVID-19 and influenza's vaccinations. But there are different types of vaccinations, and I hope I was clear with that, and certain vaccines are better for certain diseases. So choose the best vaccine for you, and please get vaccinated for both COVID-19 and influenza this autumn as soon as possible. Thanks for having me.